The moment Marcella Prescott pushed open the swinging doors of the Silver Spur Saloon, every conversation inside died like a candle snuffed out by a sudden wind, and every pair of eyes in the smoky, whiskey-soaked room turned to stare at the woman who had no business being there. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Red Rock, Texas, sat baking under a relentless October sun that had no intention of cooling down just because the calendar insisted summer was over. Red Rock was the kind of town that had grown up fast and mean, a place where cattle drives converged, and the railroad had recently laid its iron fingers within 30 miles, close enough to change everything and far enough to keep things wild. The Silver Spur occupied the very heart of Main Street, wedged between the land office and a dry goods store that smelled of leather and sawdust, and it was the kind of establishment where respectable women did not set foot under any circumstances. Marcella Prescott was, in every outward way, a respectable woman. She was 31 years old, dark-haired and gray-eyed, with a posture that came from years of trying to take up less space in a world that had already given her too little of it. She wore a charcoal dress that had been properly pressed that morning despite everything she was carrying inside, and she had pinned her hair up beneath a small hat that she clutched now in her gloved hands, turning it by its brim because she needed something to do with her fingers. She was a widow of 8 months. Her husband, George Prescott, had ridden out of their homestead on a Tuesday morning and had never come back, and the law had told her he was likely dead, and the land was likely forfeit, and she was likely on her own, and all of that had been told to her with the same expression a man uses when he is explaining something complicated to someone he does not expect to understand. She was done waiting for other people to find things out for her. The saloon smelled of stale beer, pipe smoke, and the particular unwashed quality of men who had been working hard in the sun. A piano player in the corner had stopped mid-melody and was watching her with his hands still poised above the keys. A woman in a red dress who had been leaning against the bar straightened up and raised an eyebrow. 3 card players at a table nearest the door had simply frozen, their cards held in their hands, forgotten. Marcella walked to the bar. She did not look sideways, and she did not slow down, and she did not let her chin drop even a fraction of an inch, though her heart was hammering so hard she was certain the man behind the bar could hear it when she stopped in front of him. "I am looking for someone who knows about the Rafter Cross outfit," she said clearly. "I was told this is where the men who ride for them come to drink." The barkeep, a broad-shouldered man named Pete Duggan who had a scar running along his jaw from some long-ago disagreement, looked at her with the expression of a man who has just found a barn cat sitting in the center of his dining table. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this here ain't the kind of place." "I know what kind of place it is," Marcella said. "I am asking a straightforward question. Do any of the Rafter Cross riders drink here or not?" From the far end of the bar came a voice, unhurried and low, like the rumble of distant thunder that has not yet decided whether it intends to become a storm. "They do," the voice said. "But you'd be better off asking your question somewhere else." Marcella turned. The man at the end of the bar was tall enough that he had to angle himself slightly against the counter, one boot hooked on the brass rail, a glass of whiskey sitting in front of him that appeared to be his first because it was nearly full. He wore a faded blue chambray shirt and dark canvas trousers tucked into worn boots, a hat pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he had forgotten it was there. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut out of weathered wood, and dark brown eyes that were watching her with the particular quality of a man who pays attention to things other people walk past without noticing. He was, she judged, somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of lean, rope-cord build that came from years of physical work and never quite enough to eat. He was not handsome in any conventional way, but there was something in his face that made you want to keep looking at it, something honest and a little worn, like a good piece of furniture that had been through several hard winters. "I was not asking for your opinion on where I ought to be," Marcella said, keeping her voice polite but firm. "I was asking for information." The man studied her for a moment. He picked up his whiskey glass, considered it, set it back down without drinking. Rafter Cross is Elias Vane's operation, he said. Runs about 800 head up through the canyon country north of here. His men are rough. The kind of rough you don't want asking questions of, especially if those questions are going to make someone at the Rafter Cross feel like they've got something to hide. He paused. Which I'm guessing they do, since you don't look like a woman who came all this way to buy cattle. My husband worked for Elias Vane, Marcella said. 8 months ago he rode out there for his wages and never came home. I want to know what happened to him. The silence in the saloon had the texture of held breath. Even the card players had put their cards down entirely now. The tall man at the end of the bar looked at her differently then. Not with pity, which she could not have stood, and not with dismissal, which she had grown accustomed to from every sheriff and deputy and land agent she had spoken to in the past 8 months. He looked at her with something closer to recognition, as though she had said a word in a language he had not expected to hear spoken in this place. George Prescott was your husband, he said. It was not a question. Marcella's hands tightened on the brim of her hat. You knew him. I rode with him briefly 2 years back, before he settled. The man straightened from the bar, picked up his hat by the crown, and settled it properly on his head. He walked the length of the bar toward her, and she noticed he moved quietly for a man of his size, with the deliberate, balanced walk of someone who has learned to be careful about where he puts his feet. Tobias Hadley, he said, offering his hand. She took it. Marcella Prescott. I know who you are, he said. George talked about you plenty. She did not know what to do with that, so she filed it away. Then you understand why I need to find out what happened to him. The sheriff told me George likely rode off, left me, but George would not have left, Mr. Hadley. He was not that kind of man. No, Tobias agreed quietly. He wasn't. So I need to talk to someone from the Rafter Cross, someone who might have seen him that day or knows something they haven't told anyone. Tobias was quiet for a long moment. Behind them, the piano player tentatively began playing again. Something soft and wandering that restored a fragile sense of normalcy to the room. Pete the barkeep had gone back to wiping glasses with a rag that was probably not making them any cleaner. There are 2 Rafter Cross men who drink here regular, Tobias said finally. Clem Dodd and a younger one they call Hat because he collects them. Clem is the one you want. He was foreman there for a while before Vane replaced him. He's got no great love for Elias Vane anymore, and he might talk. He paused, looking at her steadily. But Clem won't talk to a woman alone. He's the kind of man who doesn't take women seriously unless there's another man present to validate the conversation, which is a sorry state of affairs, but that's the truth of it. Marcella absorbed this with the practiced patience of someone who has heard it before in various forms. And I suppose you're offering to be that man, she said, not without a slight edge. I'm saying I know Clem and I know where he'll be tonight and I know how to get him talking, Tobias said. What you do with that information is entirely your choice. She looked at him for a moment, measuring. The thing about grief was that it left you with a particular kind of clarity. 8 months of being told no, being told to go home, being told the matter was settled, had burned away a great deal of patience and delicacy and left behind something harder and more practical. She needed help. This man was offering it. The question was simply whether he could be trusted. He met her gaze evenly and did not look away and did not try to charm her with a smile. He just waited, and that steadiness of his, that willingness to simply wait, was what made up her mind. All right, Mr. Hadley, she said. Where do we find Clem Dodd? Tobias had a room at the Redrock Hotel, a sparse affair with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the livery stable. Marcella had a room there too, she informed him, because she had ridden in from her homestead that morning. A 2-hour ride that she had made alone because there was no one left to ride with her. Her nearest neighbor was a Swedish farmer 3 miles east who spoke little English and had troubles of his own. They agreed to meet in the hotel lobby at 6:30, when Clem Dodd would reliably be seated at his usual table in the saloon for his evening meal and first drink of the night. Tobias went to stable his horse and do whatever it was he needed to do in the intervening hours, and Marcella went back to her room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her hands together in her lap and tried to organize herself. She thought about George. She always thought about George in unguarded moments, the way grief works, sliding in through any door you leave unlocked. He had been a good man, George Prescott. Not a perfect man, he could be stubborn, and he had a way of going quiet when things were difficult that she had found maddening, and he was never very good with money. But he had been honest and steady, and he had loved her in the uncomplicated, unshakable way that she had not known she needed until she had it, and then suddenly did not have it anymore. The sheriff's theory that George had simply ridden away from his marriage, and his debts made her want to break things. She had known George down to the bone, and he would no more have abandoned her than he would have grown wings and flown away. Something had happened to him at the Rafter Cross. She knew it the way she knew the coming of rain, in her joints and her gut and somewhere deeper than either of those things, and she was going to find out what it was if it was the last task she completed on this earth. She straightened her hair, refreshed her face with water from the washstand, and went down to the lobby at 6:25. Tobias was already there, standing near the door with his hat in his hand, wearing a clean shirt that was only slightly less faded than the one before. He had shaved, she noticed, which struck her as a courtesy she had not expected and which she found, despite herself, rather touching. "I want to be clear about something before we go in," she said when she reached him. "All right," he said. "I appreciate your assistance, but I will be conducting this conversation myself. I don't need you to speak for me. I just need you to be there so that Clem Dodd deigns to speak at all." Something shifted at the corner of Tobias's mouth, not quite a smile but the suggestion of one. "Understood completely," he said. "I'll just stand there and look useful. Can you manage that?" "I'll do my best," he said, and opened the door for her. Clem Dodd turned out to be a man in his late 50s with a deeply lined face and the look of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions outdoors. He was eating a plate of beans and salt pork when they approached his table, and he looked up at Tobias first with the cautious wariness of a man who has learned to read danger in the way people walk toward him, and then at Marcella with surprise, and then back at Tobias with a complicated expression. "Hadley," he said. "Who's the lady?" "Marcella Prescott," Tobias said. "George Prescott's wife. She has some questions, and I told her you were a man who valued the truth." Clem set down his fork. "George Prescott," he repeated, and something moved behind his eyes that Marcella catalogued immediately. It was not blankness. It was recognition followed by a very quick attempt to shut recognition down. She had seen that expression on the deputy, on the land agent, on two different men she had spoken to over the past 8 months who had claimed to know nothing. It was the expression of someone choosing their words very carefully. "You knew him," she said, taking the chair across from him without waiting to be invited. "He rode out to the Rafter Cross last February to collect wages Elias Vane owed him for the previous season's work. He never came home. I would like to know what happened." Clem looked at his plate. He looked at Tobias. He looked at the table, the wall, his own hands. "I was already gone from the Rafter Cross by February," he said. "Vane let me go in January. But you were there long enough to know the operation," Marcella pressed. "You were there long enough to know the kind of things Elias Vane does when men come asking for money he owes them." Clem was very quiet. The piano was going in the background, something lively and at odds with the weight of the conversation. "Mrs. Prescott," he said slowly, "I have a sister in Fort Worth and 2 nephews I'm fond of. I'd like to stay healthy enough to visit them regular." "I understand your concern for your own safety," Marcella said, and she leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice low and direct. "I also understand that you are a man who was wronged by Elias Vane, and that men like Elias Vane continue to do harm precisely because good people are afraid to speak. My husband is dead. I believe he is dead. I need to know how and why, and I need someone to say it so that something can be done about it. I am not asking you to go to the law. I am asking you to tell me what you know so that I can decide what to do next." Clem looked at Tobias for a long moment. Tobias said nothing, exactly as he had promised, but he held Clem's gaze steadily. Clem finally looked back at his beans as though he were reading something in them. "There was a man came to the rafter cross in February," he said quietly. "I heard about it later from one of the hands who left after things changed. Said a fellow came asking for his back wages. Vane was in a bad temper that week, had a buyer back out of a deal and lost a significant sum. He told his men to run the fellow off." He stopped, and Marcella's voice was very steady. "And they did," Clem said, still looking at his plate. "But it went further than running him off. That's all I know. I wasn't there. I just heard about it secondhand from a man named Ruiz who left the outfit in the spring and went down to San Antonio. I can't tell you more than that because I don't know more than that. Would this man Ruiz speak to me? He might. He felt badly about what he heard. He's a decent man who got mixed up with an indecent outfit." Clem finally looked up at her, and his eyes were tired and sad in a way that felt genuine. "I'm sorry about your husband, Mrs. Prescott. He had the look of a good man the few times I saw him." Marcella sat with that for a moment. A good man. Yes, he had been. "Thank you, Mr. Dodd," she said, and she meant it. They walked out of the saloon and into the cooling evening air of a Texas October, the stars beginning to appear overhead in their usual reckless profusion, the way they did in open country, where there was nothing to compete with their brightness. Marcella stopped on the wooden sidewalk and stood for a moment with her face tilted slightly upward, just breathing, just trying to set her thoughts in order. "He's dead," she said, not to Tobias particularly, just saying it into the evening air because she needed to hear it in her own voice. "I knew it, but now I know it." "Clem didn't say for certain," Tobias said carefully. "He didn't need to." She lowered her face and looked at the street, the horses tied at the rail, the lamplight falling in rectangles from the saloon windows. "He said things went further than running him off. George did not come home. The arithmetic is not complicated." She took a breath. "San Antonio is 4 days' ride." Tobias was quiet for a moment. "What are you planning to do?" "Find this man Ruiz," she said. "Get him to tell me what he knows. And then take that information to someone in a position to do something about Elias Vane." She turned to look at him. "The county sheriff here is useless. I've spoken to him. He practically told me Vane's money was longer than my arm and there was nothing to be done. But if I have a witness, a real witness who was connected to the rafter cross, that changes things. I can go to the federal marshal at Austin." Tobias looked at her with that steady, attentive look he had, as though he were seeing more than just the surface of things. "You're going to ride to San Antonio alone," he said. It was not quite a question. "I rode here alone," she pointed out. "That's 2 hours across open range. San Antonio is 4 days of hard country, through territory that has its own complications." He said it plainly, without drama. "There are bands of outlaws working the roads between here and the Medina River right now. I've ridden that route twice in the past 6 months and I wouldn't recommend it to someone traveling alone. Do you have a better suggestion?" "Yes," he said. "I'll go with you." She blinked. "Pardon me. I'll go with you." He said it simply, with no elaboration, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Mr. Hadley," she said, trying to find the right way to phrase what she wanted to say. "You don't know me. I am a woman you met 2 hours ago in a saloon. You have your own business to attend to, your own. My business can wait," he said. "And I knew your husband. I liked your husband. He was a straight-dealing man who deserved better than what it sounds like he got." He paused. "And regardless of all of that, I'm not going to stand here on this sidewalk and watch you ride off into 4 days of rough country alone, Mrs. Prescott. I just am not going to do it. So you can accept my company or we can argue about it on this sidewalk for as long as you like, but the end result is going to be the same." She studied him for a long moment. The lamplight from the saloon window caught the angles of his face, the serious set of his jaw, the patience in his eyes. There was nothing in his expression that suggested this was performance, or that he wanted anything from her except to see her reach San Antonio in one piece. He was simply a man who had made up his mind. She ought to have said no. Every sensible convention of the time said she ought to have said no, that it was improper and ill-advised and that she should find a different way. But she had spent 8 months following sensible conventions and had gotten precisely nowhere. "I leave at dawn," she said. "I'll have the horses ready," he said. She turned and walked back to the hotel. She was 3 steps along the sidewalk before she stopped and turned back. Mr. Hadley. He had not moved. Mrs. Prescott. "George," she said, "when you rode with him, he talked about me." Something in Tobias's expression softened in a way that he did not try to conceal or control. "All the time," he said quietly. "He described this stew you made with dried apples and said it was the finest thing he'd ever tasted in his life. He said you had the best laugh of any woman he'd ever known." He stopped, as though making sure he said the next part correctly. "He said he missed you every single day he was on the road, and that the only thing worth doing was getting back to you." Marcella turned before he could see her face properly, and walked the rest of the way to the hotel without looking back. She lay in the narrow bed for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to Redrock settle into its nighttime sounds, the distant, muffled piano, the occasional call of a night bird, the creak of the building around her. She thought about George's stew comment and felt the grief move through her like something physical, and then, gradually, as the night deepened, she felt something else underneath it. Something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it. Movement. The sensation that things were finally, after 8 months of terrible stillness, beginning to move. She rose before the sun. Tobias was at the livery when she arrived, saddling a bay gelding that was considerably larger than her own mare, a dun named Clara who was sensible and quiet, and had gotten Marcella out of several difficulties over the years. He had tied his bedroll and saddlebags already and was working methodically, not rushing, and he looked up when she came through the livery door with a brief nod that contained nothing unnecessary in it. "Did you sleep?" he asked, going back to the cinch. "Some," she said, which was more than she had expected. She began saddling Clara, and they worked in a comfortable silence that surprised her because she had thought it might be awkward. It was not. He was simply present in the way that some people are present, occupying space without pressing on it. The sun came up over the flat eastern horizon as they rode out of Redrock heading south, painting everything amber and rose, and a particular shade of gold that Marcella had always thought was the most generous light of the day, the light that made even scrub brush and bare caliche look beautiful. The land spread out in every direction in great rolling swells, the grass in its October coat of tawny brown, the live oaks in the draws looking almost dark by contrast. A pair of deer watched them from a distance and then bounded away with that lovely, effortless spring they had. They rode south, keeping to the main road where it ran, cutting across open range where it was more direct, and for a long time neither of them said much of anything because the morning was quiet, and there was something about the quality of the early light that seemed to discourage unnecessary talk. It was Tobias who finally spoke, and he did it the way he seemed to do most things, directly and without preamble. "How long were you married?" he asked. 6 years, she said. "We met in Abilene when I was working for a dressmaker there. George was in town with a drive. He came into the shop to get a tear mended in his coat, and he stayed an hour talking and came back the next day to see if the coat was ready, when we told him it would be 2 days. And then he came back the day after that again." She smiled at the memory, the way it arrived suddenly and unexpectedly, the way memories of people you loved always did. He was not subtle about his intentions. "No," Tobias agreed, with a warmth in his voice that told her he had gotten the same impression of George. "He wasn't much for subtlety. He proposed 4 months after that, wrote me a letter that was 3 pages long and entirely earnest, and said everything he meant without any decoration whatsoever. I said yes." She paused. "We had 5 good years and then one very hard one, and then he was gone." "The homestead," Tobias said. "It's not going well." "The homestead is, strictly speaking, no longer mine," she said flatly. "When George stopped making the payments because he was dead, though no one would call it that officially, the bank put a notice on it. I have until the end of November to resolve the debt or vacate." She heard how calm she sounded saying it and was almost impressed with herself. She had said it only a few times, and each time she had to work very hard to keep her voice level. "Which is another reason I need answers before November." Tobias was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead. "That's why you need to establish what happened," he said. "If Vane's men killed him, there's a wrongful death claim. Money owed." "Yes," she said. "Or at least that is my hope. The federal marshal in Austin has more reach than the county sheriff. If I can get Ruiz to come forward to make a proper statement, it is not certain, but it is a possibility." "It's a good plan," he said, and he said it without qualification or condescension, just a straightforward acknowledgement, and she found herself appreciating that more than she expected. They stopped midday at a creek that ran clear over smooth limestone, letting the horses drink and rest, while Marcella unpacked the food she had brought: hard bread and dried beef, and a paper of salt. And Tobias contributed a tin of peaches that he produced from his saddlebag with a slightly apologetic air, as though he wished he had more impressive provisions to offer. They sat on opposite sides of the creek bank in the shade of a large cypress tree, and shared the peaches with a pocket knife, passing the tin back and forth. And the ordinary domesticity of it was so startling after all these months of eating alone that Marcella had to look away for a moment and gather herself. "What is your business, Mr. Hadley?" she asked. "When you are not riding into uncertain situations with women you've just met." He almost smiled at that. "Cattle," he said. "I've been working drives since I was 17. Last few years I've been saving toward a piece of land up north of Fredericksburg, hill country, good grass, water year-round from a spring-fed creek. I've been scouting it this past month, talking to the current owner about price." "A ranch of your own," she said. "Eventually." He turned the tin in his hands. "It's slower going than I'd like, but it's coming." "You're not from here originally," she said. It was not quite a question. There was something in the way he spoke, some quality of formality in the construction of his sentences that suggested somewhere else. "Tennessee," he said. "Long time ago. My family had a farm. After the war after the war things were difficult for a lot of families." He said it without bitterness, but without any attempt to pretty it up either. The war had been over for 13 years by 1878, but the country it had left behind was still in the process of becoming something new, and the scars ran deep in every direction. "I came west at 19 and I never went back. Tennessee doesn't have much to offer me anymore." "I'm sorry," she said. "So am I," he said simply, and they sat in the shade of the cypress tree for a while with that, the creek running over its stones, the horses moving slowly along the bank. The first day's riding took them through open grassland and then into a country of rolling cedar breaks where the road narrowed and the shadows were deeper and more complicated. Toward evening they came into a small settlement called Creed's Ford, which amounted to a general store, a blacksmith operation, a water trough, and a cluster of small adobe buildings behind a cattle pen. There was no hotel but the storekeeper, a woman named Augustina Reyes, who ran the establishment with her husband and 2 daughters, let rooms in her back building for travelers, and she looked at Marcella and Tobias with frank, unsurprised assessment when they rode up. "2 rooms?" she asked. "2 rooms," Tobias confirmed without hesitation. Augustina nodded and showed them the way. The rooms were simple and clean, with whitewashed walls and rope-sprung beds and a smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Dinner was beans and rice and chili peppers and fresh tortillas that were the finest thing Marcella had tasted in months, and she said so to Augustina, who received the compliment with a dignified nod and refilled her plate. Tobias ate with the focused, appreciative attention of a man who knew what it was to be hungry and never took a good meal for granted. They were the only travelers, so it was just the 2 of them at the long wooden table in Augustina's kitchen, and the easy warmth of the room, the smell of the food, the lamplight casting everything in copper and gold, created an intimacy that was entirely unintentional and entirely undeniable. "Tell me about Fredericksburg," she said, because she found she wanted to know more about the piece of the future he was building in his imagination. He described it with a quiet, careful attention to detail that told her it was a place he had visited many times in his mind. The spring-fed creek, the way the hills folded up around the valley and sheltered it from north wind, the long grass that turned silver in late afternoon light, the stand of oak trees that would make good shade for a house. He talked about what he would run on it. Not many cattle, he said, not a cattle operation so much as a horse breeding program, because there was growing demand for quality working horses as the frontier compressed and the railroad expanded, and he had always had a particular understanding of horses that went beyond what most men could manage. "How do you know you understand horses better than most men?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Because they tell me things," he said, and then looked as though he had not quite intended to say that. "They tell you things," she repeated. I don't mean they talk," he said, with a slight awkwardness that was endearing because everything else about him was so self-possessed. "But horses communicate constantly with their bodies, their breathing, the angle of their ears. Most people don't pay close enough attention. I've just always paid attention." "You pay attention to most things," she observed. He met her eyes. "I try to," he said. There was a moment that stretched a little longer than ordinary moments, and Marcella was the one who looked away first, reaching for her water glass with perfectly steady hands. "Thank you very much." The second day of riding was harder. The road climbed through rougher country, limestone ridges and cactus flats and long stretches where the wind came in hot from the southwest carrying grit. They rode mostly in companionable conversation now, the awkwardness of strangers having largely dissolved overnight, replaced by something more comfortable. She learned that he had read widely, which surprised her and then made her feel slightly ashamed of being surprised, because there was no reason a cowboy could not be a reader. He told her he had always carried books when he could get them, that the previous winter he had spent a snowbound week in a bunkhouse in New Mexico territory, and had read all of Dickens that the bunkhouse contained, which was 2 novels and a collection of stories. She told him about her own reading, the novels she had loved, the way she and George had taken turns reading aloud in the evenings in the early years before the homestead work had made evenings too exhausting for anything but sleep. "We were reading Cooper when the last time," she said, and then stopped, because that was further than she had intended to go with it. "Cooper's good," Tobias said, smoothly and without pressure, and she was grateful for the way he let her step back from the edge of things without making a production of it. On the second afternoon, trouble came the way it usually does in open country, suddenly, and without much warning. They were riding through a narrow cut between 2 limestone bluffs when 3 riders appeared on the road ahead of them. The riders were not moving, just sitting their horses across the width of the road in the way that makes it very clear they are not going to move on their own initiative. All 3 were rough-looking men in the specific way of men who have made a career of taking things that belong to other people, and the one in the middle was watching Tobias, and Marcella approach with the satisfied expression of someone who has just had good luck. Marcella felt her stomach drop but kept her expression still. Beside her, she noticed that Tobias's posture had not changed and his hands had not moved, but something about his quality of attention had shifted, sharpened, the way a hunting dog points. "That's far enough," said the man in the middle. "Leave your horses, your gear, and whatever cash you're carrying, and you can walk out of here just fine." Tobias looked at the 3 men for a moment with a kind of careful, measuring calm. "Gentlemen," he said pleasantly, "I appreciate the offer, but I think we'll be keeping our horses and gear and moving along." The man in the middle narrowed his eyes. He was reaching for something on his saddle when Tobias made a movement that was very fast and very precise, and suddenly he had a rifle that had been in his saddle scabbard in his hands leveled, the action already cocked. "Here is what I know about this particular situation," Tobias said, with the same pleasant conversational tone. "There are 3 of you and 1 of me, which sounds favorable to your side. But I shoot well enough that 2 of you are going to have a very bad afternoon before the 3rd one gets to do anything useful. So the practical question is, which 2 of you are willing to have that bad afternoon so the other one can try his luck?" He paused. "Take your time thinking about it." The 3 men looked at each other. They looked at the rifle. They looked at the particular quality of steadiness in the man holding it. The conversation among them, conducted entirely in exchanged glances, appeared to reach a conclusion. They turned their horses and rode back the way they had come without another word. Tobias kept the rifle up until they were well around the bend and gone, and then he let out a long, slow breath and lowered it and replaced it in the scabbard. "Well done," Marcella said, meaning it absolutely. "I genuinely hope they think it through and choose a different line of work," he said, and she laughed because it was such an unexpected thing to say, and her laughter startled a bird out of the scrub beside the road. He looked at her when she laughed. It was just a look, brief and quickly redirected back to the road ahead, but she had caught it, and something about it settled in her chest and stayed there for the rest of the afternoon, warm and slightly alarming. That evening they made camp beside a bend in the river. A proper camp this time. No settlement nearby with a fire in a ring of stones, and the river murmuring close by and the sky above them so vast and densely starred that it seemed to be showing off. Tobias made coffee in a battered tin pot and handed her a cup, and they sat by the fire in the way that people sit by fires at the end of long, difficult days, relaxed into the warmth of it, letting the silence be what it was. "Can I ask you something?" She said. "You can ask me anything," he said. "Why are you really doing this?" She held her cup in both hands and looked at him across the fire. "I mean, you don't know me. The argument about knowing George is a reason to be kind to me for half an hour in a saloon, but it is not a reason to ride to San Antonio and back. What is it really?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking into the fire, and she had the impression he was thinking about what he actually wanted to say as opposed to what it would be easier or more comfortable to say. She appreciated that. "I've spent 15 years moving from one place to the next," he said finally. "Driving cattle, working for other men, saving towards something of my own. And in all that time I've gotten very good at not getting attached to things, because if you get attached to things and they move or change or get taken away, it costs you something you need for the work ahead." He looked up from the fire. "What I am trying to say, and not doing it very well, is that I am tired of being a man who keeps passing through. And when I saw you walk into that saloon today, this woman in her proper gray dress with her hat in her hands and her chin absolutely up, asking questions nobody else was willing to ask, looking for justice for a man she loved, I don't know. Something in me just said, this matters. This is a thing that matters and you should not ride past it." Marcella looked at him for a long moment in the firelight. "That is the most words I have heard you say at once," she said softly. "Yes," he agreed with a slight expression that was almost embarrassed. "I probably should have stopped 2 sentences ago." "No," she said. "You should not have." She looked back at the fire. "Thank you for telling me the truth." "I would rather tell the truth than be comfortable," he said. "It's basically the only policy I have managed to maintain consistently." She smiled at that, a real smile, and it felt strange in her face because she had not done much of it lately and the muscles were rusty. But it felt good too. She slept that night rolled in her blanket a decent distance from the fire, and she slept better than she had in months, which she was not entirely sure what to do with. The 3rd day brought them into the broader valleys that preceded the hill country north of San Antonio, where the land gentled somewhat and the vegetation changed to include more oak and pecan along the creeks. They talked more easily now, the conversation moving through subjects with a naturalness that continued to surprise her. He told her about the drives he had been on up to Kansas, out through New Mexico, once on a particularly ill-fated venture down to the Gulf that had ended in a fever epidemic and the loss of half the herd to a flooded river. She told him about Kansas, where she had grown up, the particular quality of the light there, the way the prairie stretched in every direction until it met the sky with such absolute confidence. She told him about her parents, her mother's fierce practicality and her father's gentle, wandering intelligence, both of them gone now, her father to a fever when she was 14 and her mother to a hard winter 6 years after that. "You've had to be very strong for a long time," he said. "Most women have," she said, without complaint, just as a statement of fact. "Yes," he agreed, "they have," and she appreciated that he did not try to tell her she was exceptional or special, because she did not need to be exceptional to deserve a decent life. She just needed people to stop putting obstacles in the way of it. They made San Antonio as the fourth day's sun was low in the west, coming into the city from the north along a road that grew increasingly busy with wagons and riders and pedestrians. San Antonio in 1878 was a proper city, larger than anything Marcella had been in for years. The old Spanish missions on its outskirts, the Plaza de Armas at its heart, a babel of languages in its streets, Spanish and English and German intermixed, the cattle trade and the military presence and the merchant class all colliding in the bustling, lively way of a place at the crossroads of several different futures simultaneously. It smelled of cooking fires and cattle pens, and the acequia water channels that threaded through the city in the old Spanish fashion. They found lodgings at a respectable boarding house on a street off the main plaza, where the proprietress was a German woman named Mrs. Hartman, who asked no intrusive questions and provided excellent meals and reliable hot water. 2 rooms again, side by side on the second floor. Finding Ruiz took most of the following morning. Clem Dodd had given Tobias a general district of the city and the name of a cantina where Ruiz was said to be a regular customer. They found the cantina easily enough, a low adobe building on a narrow street near the river, and the barman there knew Ruiz and sent a boy to fetch him. And by midday they were seated at a table in the cantina's shaded courtyard with a man named Francisco Ruiz, who was perhaps 50 years old, compact and serious-faced, with the careful eyes of someone who has been in enough difficult situations to approach new ones with sustained caution. He looked at Marcella steadily when Tobias explained who she was and why they had come. He did not speak for a long time. "Clem Dodd sent you to me," he said finally. "He said you were a decent man who felt badly about what happened," Marcella said. Ruiz looked at his hands on the table. They were calloused and scarred in the way of a man who had worked outdoors his whole life. "I was not there," he said. "I was not present when it happened. I want to be clear about that." "I understand," Marcella said, "but you know what did happen." "I know what 2 men told me," he said. "Men who were there, men who left the outfit afterward because they didn't want to be part of what Vane was running." "Tell me," she said. And she said it quietly, without dramatics, just with the simple directness of a woman who has been waiting 8 months to hear the truth and is finally sitting in front of it. Ruiz told them. It took a while and it was painful to hear, and Marcella kept her hands flat on the table and her face still and listened to all of it without looking away. A man had come to the Rafter Cross Ranch house in late February, a man matching George's description, asking for the wages owed to him for the previous season. Vane had been in a fury about other matters. He had sent his men to turn the visitor away. There had been a confrontation. The visitor had not gone quietly, which Marcella could believe because George, for all his quiet nature, had never been a man who accepted injustice with equanimity. The confrontation had gone badly. By the time it was over, the visitor was not in a condition to ride home. Ruiz said where the man had been buried, a dry creek bed 2 miles north of the Rafter Cross headquarters, under a particular bend in the wash where a white caliche formation jutted up from the bank. Marcella sat with all of that for a long moment, and then she thanked Francisco Ruiz quietly and asked him if he would be willing to make a formal statement before the federal marshal. He thought about it for a long time. He looked at his hands, the courtyard wall, the narrow strip of sky above. He thought about whatever it was that weighs a man's conscience against his desire for safety and peace. "Yes," he said finally. "I will do it. I have a wife and children, and I have been ashamed long enough." He looked at Marcella directly. "I am sorry, Mrs. Prescott. I am sorry it took this long, and I am sorry for what was done." "Thank you," she said. "Thank you." She was very controlled walking out of the cantina. She made it to the street, and then to the corner where the street met a quieter alley that ran along the back of the building. And there she stopped and leaned against the cool adobe wall and let herself cry, quietly, with her face turned toward the wall and her hand pressed over her mouth. Just a few minutes. Just the grief of finally knowing, of the ambiguity that had sustained some small, irrational hope being at last resolved into the thing she had already known in her bones for 8 months. Tobias stood nearby, not too close, not too far. He did not try to speak, and he did not try to touch her, and he did not look away in the performative discomfort of someone who cannot handle another person's pain. He just stood there in the alley, steady and present, and when she had gathered herself and straightened and turned around, he was looking at her with an expression that was simple and unguarded and full of something she was not ready to name yet. "I need a minute," she said, unnecessarily. "Take as many as you need," he said. She took 3. Then she smoothed her dress and lifted her chin and said, "The federal marshal's office. Do you know where it is?" "I'll find out," he said. The federal marshal's office was on the far side of the plaza, and the marshal himself was a weathered, methodical man named Sayers who listened to what Marcella told him with a growing expression of focused attention. When she laid out what she knew, what Ruiz had told her and was willing to swear to, and what she was asking him to do about Elia's vein and the rafter cross, Marshal Sayers sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "Elia's vein is not an easy man to move against," he said. "He is also a man who had another man killed rather than pay him his wages," Marcella said, "with a witness willing to testify." Sayers looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Tobias. He looked out his window at the plaza, where a cart pulled by 2 oxen was creaking slowly past. "I'll need that witness here in this office within the week," he said. "Written statement. And I'll need you to be available to make your own statement about what Dodd told you in Reed Rock." "This will take time, Mrs. Prescott. The law is not fast." "I know that," she said. "I have been waiting 8 months. It may be several months more," he said. "Will it result in charges against Vane?" He met her eyes. "If the witness holds up and the statement is solid, yes, I believe it will," she nodded once. "Then I will wait as long as it takes." They spent 3 days in San Antonio arranging everything. Ruiz came to the marshal's office the following morning and gave his statement in the careful, unhurried manner of a man who has decided that the right thing and the comfortable thing are not the same thing, and has chosen the right thing. Marcella gave her own statement. Marshal Sayers promised to contact the Reed Rock County Sheriff and initiate the process of a proper investigation, including, he said in a matter-of-fact tone that somehow made it more significant, the recovery of remains from the location Ruiz had described. There was also the matter of the homestead debt. The federal marshal had a colleague in the land office who turned out to be useful on this point. There was a provision, rarely invoked but real, that debt on a property could be suspended pending the outcome of a wrongful death investigation. Marcella would not lose the land. Not yet. Not while the law was moving. She walked out of the land office into the San Antonio afternoon feeling lighter than she had in 8 months. Not happy, because grief does not lift like that, like a coat you can simply remove, but lighter, as though someone had taken some of the weight she had been carrying and said, "Here, this part you don't have to hold anymore." Tobias was waiting outside on the wooden walkway, sitting on the edge of it with his long legs stretched out and his face tipped up to the sun. He looked up when she came out. "Well," he said, "the homestead is safe for now," she said, and the marshal is moving forward." He stood, his face doing the thing where it did not quite smile, but everything around the eyes suggested that it wanted to. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said. "Very good." She stood on the walkway with the San Antonio sunlight falling on everything and the plaza alive around them, and she felt something shifting inside her that was different from the grief shifting. That was something else entirely, something tentative and warm and a little frightening. "I owe you a great debt, Mr. Hadley." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I do," she said. "You didn't have to come. You insisted on coming, actually, as I recall." "I did," he agreed. "And you were right," she said, "and I am grateful." They looked at each other for a moment in the afternoon light, and the city moved around them, indifferent and busy and full of its own concerns, and something passed between them that was not yet a declaration but was decidedly more than gratitude. "There's a good restaurant on the plaza," Tobias said. "One of the Mrs. Hartman's neighbors told me about it. Proper food, tablecloths, the kind of place you'd find in a city." He looked at her steadily. "I would very much like to take you to dinner tonight, Mrs. Prescott, if you'll accept." Marcella considered this. "As a thank you," she said. "As whatever you'd like to call it," he said. She looked at him for another moment. He was not moving. He was just waiting again with that particular patience of his, letting her decide without pressure. "All right, Mr. Hadley," she said. "Dinner." The restaurant was, in fact, excellent, a proper establishment with white tablecloths and a menu handwritten in both English and Spanish, and candles on the tables, and the rich, complex smell of proper cooking. They sat across from each other in the candlelight, and the conversation was entirely different from the practical, purposeful talk of the past several days. It wandered and curved and doubled back, ranging from her memories of Kansas to his of Tennessee, to books they had read, to what they thought about the railroad changing the country, to whether the stars looked different from different places, which led to a somewhat spirited debate that neither of them resolved. He told her a story about a horse he had once trained that had an absolute and apparently principled refusal to walk over any bridge, wooden or stone, and the creative solutions he had attempted to resolve this. And she laughed freely and fully, and he watched her laugh with an expression that he made no effort to conceal, and she found that she did not want him to conceal it. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she said at some point, which she would not have said except that the wine was good and the candlelight was warm and he was very easy to talk to. He thought about it seriously. "I talked to the horses," he said. "You said they tell you things." "It goes both ways," he said. "I talk to them, not just instructions, actual conversation. I tell them what I'm thinking about, what the weather looks like, what I'm planning to do. I think they appreciate it." "I think that is lovely," she said, and she meant it. He looked at her across the table. "Your turn," he said. She thought about it. "I've been more afraid in the past 8 months than I have ever been in my life," she said. Not the practical fears, though there were plenty of those, but afraid of being alone, afraid that I would be alone for the rest of my life and that I would get used to it and then stop even knowing what I was missing." She paused. "That is the thing I have not told anyone." He looked at her quietly. The candle between them guttered slightly in an invisible current of air. "That makes sense," he said carefully. "It also seems to me that a woman who rides to San Antonio alone to get justice for her dead husband and faces down 3 outlaws on the road without so much as flinching is probably not going to be alone for long if she doesn't want to be." "I did not face down the outlaws," she pointed out. "You did. You sat your horse without moving a muscle," he said. "Most people would have broken for the brush. You sat there completely still and let me deal with it. That's not nothing." She smiled. "I was terrified." "So was I," he said, somewhat. "The trick is not to look it." She looked at him across the candle-lit table and thought, with a clarity that was almost alarming, that she wanted to know this man better. Not in any urgent or dramatic way. Simply that she wanted more evenings like this one, more conversations that wandered widely, more of that particular quality of attention he gave to things and people, which was the sort of attention that made the recipient feel genuinely visible. They walked back to the boarding house through the warm San Antonio night. The plaza quiet now, the Essequia water running silver in the moonlight, and they walked slightly closer together than they had been walking on the road, though not touching. At the door of the boarding house, Marcella stopped and turned to face him. He was a head taller than her, and she had to tilt her chin slightly to look at him properly, which she did without self-consciousness. "Thank you for dinner," she said, "and for all of it, the whole journey." "Thank you for letting me come," he said. There was a pause that was full of things neither of them said, and then she went inside, and he followed a moment later, and their rooms were side by side, and both doors were closed for the night. And that was all, but it was a different kind of all than it had been before. The ride back to Redrock took the same 4 days. The road felt different going back. The same landscape, but somehow altered by familiarity. The way a road always changes once you've traveled it and know what comes next. They talked the entire way, and the things they talked about deepened and widened, moving from the factual to the personal to the philosophical in the organic way that happens between people who are discovering that they like each other more with every hour that passes. She told him about her father reading to her in the evenings, the specific books, the exact quality of the lamplight in the parlor of her childhood home. He told her about learning to ride, how it had been the first thing he had ever done that felt completely right, the way his body had simply understood horses in a way it hadn't understood most other things. She told him what she wanted for the homestead if she was able to keep it: a bigger garden, chickens, perhaps a milk cow, the kind of small-scale abundance that would make it feel less like something she was fighting to hold onto and more like a place where she actually lived. He told her about the spring-fed creek in the hill country and the house he had been building in his mind for years, and as he described it, she found herself seeing it clearly, the way you see things when someone describes them with real love and attention to detail. They passed through Creed's Ford on the 3rd day back, and Augustina Reyes saw them coming and had coffee ready almost as though she had expected them. "You find what you were looking for?" she asked Marcella, her dark eyes direct and warm. "Yes," Marcella said, "and more besides." She said it without looking at Tobias, but she was aware of him standing slightly to her left and aware that he could hear her. On the 4th day, with Redrock on the horizon in the late afternoon light, they slowed the horses without speaking about it, and the ride stretched itself out in the way of something neither of them was in a hurry to finish. "What happens now?" Tobias said. "I go back to the homestead," Marcella said. "Wait for the law to move, try to keep the property going. Plant whatever I can get in the ground before the frost comes." She paused. "And you go back to your hill country property and your negotiations." "Yes," he said, but there was a quality in how he said it. "That doesn't have to be the end of things," she said carefully, "if you were inclined." He was looking at her. The afternoon light was gold on everything, the way it had been that first morning riding out of Redrock, generous and warm. "Mrs. Prescott," he said, and then stopped. "Marcella," she said, "you might as well." Something in his face changed when she said it. Something opened. "Marcella," he said, as though he were trying it on, "I am going to ride out to my property in Fredericksburg and finalize the purchase, because that is something I need to do, and it will take 2 weeks. And then I would like to ride to your homestead and call on you. Properly. With whatever fruit or flowers I can acquire en route, though I acknowledge the options in this part of Texas are limited." She felt something in her chest open and widen and settle warm, the way a fire settles when it gets enough air. "I think that would be very nice," she said. "Good," he said, and his expression had become, for the first time, fully and openly a smile, the complete version, and it transformed his whole face in a way that made her suddenly understand why she had been trying not to make him smile before, because now that he was doing it, it was extraordinarily difficult not to respond in kind. She responded in kind. She could not help herself. They rode into Redrock in the last of the golden afternoon light. The 2 weeks Tobias was away in Fredericksburg were the strangest 2 weeks Marcella had experienced in a long time, not because they were particularly eventful, but because she was aware of time passing in a way she had not been since before George died. She was aware of days counting. She fixed fence line and tended the horses and turned over the vegetable garden for the winter and wrote a letter to Marshal Sayers following up on the investigation. And she did all of it with a kind of purposeful energy that she had not had for 8 months, as though something had been switched back on inside her. She thought about Tobias with a frequency that she found both embarrassing and undeniable. She thought about the way he moved, the way he talked, the way he sat by the campfire with his long legs stretched toward the warmth, the way he had said her name for the first time like he was taking something seriously. She thought about his spring-fed creek and his future horses and the house he had been building in his mind, and she thought about it in a way that she would not allow herself to examine too closely yet, because it was too new and too fragile, and she was still in the process of understanding what it meant to be a woman with a future again. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 14 days exactly from when they had parted in Reed Rock. She heard the horse before she saw it, looked up from the fence post she was repairing, and watched him come up the long flat road toward the homestead in the early November light, which was thinner and cooler than October but still lovely in its pale, clear way. He had flowers. He was holding them slightly awkwardly, the way a man holds flowers when he has not done it many times before, a bunch of dried prairie grass, and the last of the season's yellow wildflowers tied with a piece of twine, and she felt a wave of warmth so acute it was almost physical. He pulled up and dismounted and stood there in her yard in his faded shirt with his slightly awkward flowers, and looked at her with an expression that was open and direct and a little uncertain in a way she had not seen on him before, and that uncertainty was the most endearing thing about him. The options were indeed limited, he said, regarding the flowers. They're perfect, she said, and took them and meant it. She made coffee on the wood stove, and they sat at her kitchen table in the November afternoon and picked up their conversation as though the 2 weeks had been 2 hours. And he told her about the Fredericksburg property and the handshake deal he had made with the current owner, a German farmer named Heinrich Bauer, who was retiring to his daughter's household in San Antonio, and was glad to see the land go to someone who would take proper care of it. The transfer would be finalized in the spring, when the payment was fully in order. He described the creek, the way it ran cold even in summer, the sound it made over the stones, the way the oaks along its banks went copper and gold in fall, and she listened with a fullness of attention that was partly about the creek and partly about the man describing it. "I want to show it to you," he said. "When things are settled here, when the weather is better, I want you to see it." "I would like that," she said. He came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and by the third Sunday it had become simply the expected shape of the week, and she was aware that several of her neighbors had noticed and formed opinions about it, and she found that she cared considerably less about this than convention said she should. He was not trying to court her in the fashionable way of careful, prescribed steps. He was simply present. He helped her rehang the barn door that had been sticking since September. He replaced a section of rotted board in the porch. He brought books from Reed Rock when he went in for supplies and sat across from her in the kitchen reading while she mended things, and they talked about what they were reading, and it was so much like the evening she had described from her early married life, the reading aloud, the conversation, that it ached and warmed simultaneously. One afternoon in late November he looked up from his book and said, with no preceding context, "I need to tell you something." She put down her mending. "All right." He set the book on the table and looked at her directly, with that quality of careful honesty that was, she had come to understand, simply how he operated. "I have been in love with you since approximately the second evening of the San Antonio road trip," he said. "I know the timing of that is, the situation you're in is complicated, and I am not putting any pressure on you, and I won't be hurt if you tell me the timing isn't right. But I would be being dishonest with you if I pretended it wasn't true, and I don't want to be dishonest with you." Marcella looked at him across the kitchen table. The November light came in gray and soft through the window, and the wood stove ticked with warmth, and outside a wind was moving through the dry grass. "The second evening," she said. "By the campfire," he said. "When you told me the real reason you're afraid. You trusted me with something true, and that was yes, the second evening." She thought about what she wanted to say, not what was appropriate or proper or safe, but what was true. "I am still grieving," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that. He was real and he was loved, and that doesn't go away. I don't think it should go away. But I am here, Tobias, and I am finding that here is a place I want to be. And that you are someone I want very much to have near me." She paused. "Is that enough for now?" "That is everything," he said. He stayed for dinner that evening, and she made the stew with dried apples that George had told him about. And when Tobias had the first spoonful, he stopped and looked up at her with an expression so unguarded and unexpectedly moved that she had to look down at her own bowl for a moment. "George was right," he said. "It is the finest thing." They sat at the table in the warm lamplight and ate stew and talked and laughed, and the evening went long past when it should have ended. And when he finally rose to ride back to his room in Redrock, he put on his hat at the door and turned back and said, "Marcella." She looked at him. "I will be here Sunday," he said. "I know," she said. He was there Sunday. The marshal's investigation moved slowly through the winter, as Marshal Sayers had warned, but it moved. A deputy was sent to the Rafter Cross in December to investigate the location Ruiz had provided. The remains were found. George Prescott was officially declared deceased by violence, the perpetrators employed by Elias Vane, and the investigation into Vane himself was opened formally in January. By February, a year, almost to the day, from George's death, Elias Vane was arrested on charges of directing the assault resulting in death, and 2 of his men who had been at the ranch that day were likewise arrested. It would be months more before the trial, and the outcome of trials was never certain, but the law was moving, and that was more than it had been doing. The homestead debt was officially suspended pending the civil wrongful death claim, which an Austin lawyer that Marshal Sayers recommended agreed to take on. It was possible, he explained to Marcella in a letter, that the estate, such as it was, could pursue damages against Vane that would cover not only the debt but provide some additional settlement. Nothing was guaranteed, but the path was clear. Marcella received all of this news on a cold February afternoon with Tobias sitting across from her at the kitchen table reading the lawyer's letter over her shoulder, and when she set it down he said, "Well, it is moving forward," she said. "All of it is actually moving forward." "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him and he was already looking at her, and there was a moment that was different from any of the previous moments, fuller and more certain, and she leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief and deliberate, and she had decided to do it while reading the letter, though she could not have said exactly what sentence in the letter had decided it for her. He was very still for 1 second, and then he was not still at all, and he kissed her back with a careful, wondering gentleness that undid her completely, and when they separated she was aware that her hands were in the front of his shirt and his were on either side of her face. "Marcella," he said, and his voice had a quality it had not had before. "Yes," she said, in answer to a question that had not been put into words yet. He closed his eyes for a moment as though absorbing something. Then he opened them and looked at her with full, unguarded emotion. This man who was usually so composed, so careful, and the sight of him unguarded was its own kind of gift. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. "When the time is right, I don't want to rush you, but I want you to know that I intend to ask you something. When you're ready." "I know what you want to ask," she said. "Do you know what your answer will be?" She looked at him steadily. She thought about grief and time and the way that love is not a betrayal of love but sometimes the continuation of it by other means. The way a river continues after it goes underground, still moving, still going somewhere. "Yes," she said. "I know." Spring came to the Texas Hill Country in a rush, the way it does there, sudden and extravagant, everything green and gold at once. The Fredericksburg property transfer was finalized in March, and Tobias rode to the homestead the following Sunday with the deed in his saddlebag, and something else in his shirt pocket that he kept touching, as though making sure it was still there. He asked her properly after dinner, standing in the yard in the warm March evening with the first fireflies just starting to appear in the grass, and it was not a grand speech. He was not a man for grand speeches. It was simple and true and entirely himself, and she said yes in the same spirit, and that was that. They were married in Redrock in May, at the small white church on the edge of town, with Mrs. Hartman of the San Antonio boarding house in attendance because Marcella had written to her on an impulse, and Mrs. Hartman had written back saying she would not miss it, and Augustina Reyes had made the ride up from Creed's Ford with her husband and 2 daughters. Pete the barkeep from the Silver Spur stood in the back looking slightly uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes. Clem Dodd was there, standing straight and quiet at the side of the church, and Marcella caught his eye and nodded at him, and he nodded back, and that exchange contained a great deal that did not need to be spoken. Francisco Ruiz was not there because he was in Austin for the trial proceedings, which had begun in April, and were moving with agonizing legal thoroughness toward their conclusion. He was doing what he had promised, holding to his statement, being a decent man in difficult circumstances, and Marcella felt a particular gratitude for him that she expressed in a long letter she wrote after the wedding, which he answered with a brief, dignified note saying that he was glad the right thing had finally been done, for everyone's sake. The Vane trial concluded in June. Elias Vane was found guilty of directing the assault that resulted in George Prescott's death, and 2 of his men were convicted as well. Vane was sentenced to a term in the state penitentiary. It was not everything, nothing could be everything, but it was justice, real and documented and public, and Marcella sat in the Austin courtroom and heard the verdict and held very still for a long moment, and then let go of something she had been holding for more than a year. The civil case was settled in August, with Vane's considerable assets being partly liquidated to satisfy multiple claims. Marcella's share was enough to clear the homestead debt entirely, with enough remaining to begin making the improvements she had been imagining for 2 years. The larger garden, the fencing, the milk cow, eventually a proper chicken coop that did not lean like a tired man. But by August, the homestead question had become somewhat beside the point, because the Fredericksburg property was now their property, hers and Tobias's, and the question of what to do with the homestead had resolved itself naturally into putting it on the market at the end of the season, now that she had somewhere better to be. The hill country property was exactly what Tobias had described, and more besides. The spring-fed creek ran cold and clear and musical over smooth white stones, and the oaks along its banks had gone through their summer green, and were beginning to tip toward fall gold by the time they moved. The valley folded around the property in a way that felt protective rather than confining. The existing structure on the land was a modest 2-room cabin that Tobias had spent the spring improving with the focused determination of a man who has a clear picture in his mind of what he is building toward. There was a good barn, stone-walled and solid, a smokehouse, and a kitchen garden space that had been left to weeds but was excellent soil. Marcella stood on the small porch of the cabin on their first evening there and looked out at the valley and the creek and the oaks, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, the sensation of standing exactly where you are supposed to be. Tobias came and stood beside her with 2 cups of coffee, handed her one, and looked out at the same view. "Well," he said. "Well," she said, "I believe this will do." He laughed, a full, unguarded laugh that she had been collecting since March, the specific sound of this man when something genuinely delighted him, and she laughed with him, and they stood on the porch together in the September evening with the creek talking to itself in the background and the stars beginning to appear above the oaks. The first winter in the hill country was cold but not brutal, the kind of winter that tests a place rather than destroys it. They learned the land together, the way the cold air pooled in the low places by the creek on clear nights, where the good firewood was, which way the prevailing wind came in, and which side of the ridge protected against it. They bought 2 broodmares that fall, the beginning of the horse breeding operation, and Tobias spent hours in the barn with them in a way that Marcella would sometimes watch from the doorway, not wanting to interrupt, because there was something so complete about him in the presence of horses, something at rest. She started a proper kitchen garden in the spring. She planted an apple tree, a small, hopeful thing that would not bear fruit for several years but would, in the fullness of time, bear fruit that she could put into a stew that would be the finest thing anyone had tasted. She started a vegetable plot of considerable ambition, and it produced with a generosity that surprised her and supplied them for months. There was also, by the following spring, the matter of a child. She told Tobias on a March morning early, before the day had properly gotten going, standing in the kitchen in the cool blue light. She said it simply, watching his face, and his face did the thing where it did not quite smile first, and then did the thing where it fully and completely smiled, and then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and held her in a way that was careful and thorough and entirely wordless, and she felt his heartbeat against her temple and felt completely, fully, extravagantly at home. The baby came in October 1880, a boy they named James, which had been Tobias's father's name and also the name of the creek on the property, the James Branch, and which Marcella thought was a good solid name for someone who would grow up in this valley with this creek and these hills as the landscape of his childhood. James was a fine, healthy baby with a loud opinion about things and his father's dark eyes, and as he grew, a fascination with horses that appeared to be inherited at a cellular level. By the time he was 2, he would follow Tobias into the barn and stand at the stall doors watching the mares with total focused attention, and Tobias would crouch beside him and talk to him about what the horses were communicating with the angle of their ears and the set of their stance, and Marcella would stand in the barn doorway and watch them both and feel something so warm and substantial that she had no word adequate for it. The horse breeding operation grew steadily. By 1882, they had 6 mares and 2 stallions, and a reputation in the surrounding county for producing reliable, well-tempered working horses. Buyers came from as far as San Antonio. Tobias had been right about the demand, and more right about his particular ability to produce horses of excellent quality, because the understanding he had of them showed in everything. How he selected for breeding, how he trained the young horses, how he handled them at every stage. A second child came in the spring of 1883, a girl they named Clara, after Marcella's reliable dun mare who was still living out a comfortable retirement in the home pasture. And Clara the daughter shared very little of her horse's stoic practicality, and was from the beginning a creature of pronounced opinions and volcanic laughter, and a fascination with everything on the property that could be touched, climbed, or disassembled. The homestead in Raydrock had sold in the fall of 1879, and with those proceeds Tobias had been able to expand the hill country property, buying an additional 40 acres along the creek that had been owned by an elderly neighbor who moved to his son's family. The expansion included a better wood lot and a second spring that ran all year, and with it came the ability to run a proper cattle operation alongside the horses, not large, but enough to provide a reliable second income and enough beef for themselves and for sale. They built a proper house in 1882, not elaborate but solid, with a covered porch that faced the valley and a kitchen large enough to hold the table and chairs and the wood stove and still have room to move, and a parlor with a bookshelf that filled up steadily over the years. There was a room for James and a room for Clara, and a room at the back that Tobias said was for guests, and which Marcella said could serve multiple purposes, and the first time she said it, he had looked at her with the kind of look that required no translation. By 1884 the house and the land and the operation were something that Marcella, standing at her kitchen window in the morning with her coffee, could look out at and feel the deep satisfaction of having built, having fought for, having earned. It was not what she had expected her life to look like. When she was a young woman working for a dressmaker in Abilene and George Prescott came in with a torn coat. But then nothing had gone quite as expected. She had lost things she should not have lost, and done things she had not imagined herself capable of, and been helped by a tall, steady man who refused to let her go into uncertain territory alone. She thought about that frequently, the thing he had said on the San Antonio road trip that she had filed away and kept. He had said something in me just said, "This matters. This is a thing that matters and you should not ride past it." She had thought at the time he was talking about her situation, her quest for justice. She had come to understand that he meant her, not as a situation to be resolved but as a person worth staying near. The justice for George had been real and documented and public. Elias Vane served his sentence in the state penitentiary. The two men who had been convicted were likewise incarcerated. Francisco Ruiz, after the trial, had written one more letter, brief and dignified, saying that he hoped Mrs. Prescott, and he corrected himself in a postscript, crossed out with one line and wrote Mrs. Hadley, was finding her way toward good things. She had written back with 4 pages of detail about the hill country property, and the horses and James, and the apple tree, because she felt he deserved to know that the courage he had shown had contributed to a life that was good and growing and real. On a September evening in 1884, 6 years almost exactly from the day she had pushed open the swinging doors of the Silver Spur Saloon in Red Rock, Marcella stood on the porch of the stone house she and Tobias had built and watched the sun go down over the hill country hills in the particular extravagant Texas way, all amber and rose and deep violet, the oaks along the creek going dark against it. James was 9 and was somewhere in the barn. She could hear him talking to the mares, carrying on a conversation in the earnest, detailed manner of a boy who has grown up being told that horses appreciate being talked to. Clara was 4 and was sitting on the porch steps, attempting to teach the barn cat a trick. It was clearly not interested in learning, explaining the relevant steps with great patience. Tobias came out of the house and stood beside Marcella and looked at the sunset and at the valley and then at her, with the same expression he had always had when he looked at her, that open, unguarded look that she had fallen in love with by the second campfire of a journey to San Antonio, though she had not yet known what to call it. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked it the way he asked most things, simply and directly, because he wanted to know, and not because the asking was performative. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about grief and loss, and the strange, crooked path that life made when it did not go where you expected. She thought about walking into a saloon in her proper gray dress with her hat in her hands, frightened and determined and entirely alone. She thought about a man at the end of a bar who paid attention to things other people walked past, who had said this matters, and refused to ride past it. She thought about apple trees and spring-fed creeks and boys, who talked to horses and little girls who taught things to reluctant cats. She thought about justice and about the particular freedom of a morning when you look out the window and the life you see is the one you chose and built and earned. "Yes," she said, and she meant it without qualification or remainder, a clean, clear, complete yes. "I am happy." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood together on the porch in the last of the September light, while their children made their various noises below and around them, while the creek talked to itself in its perennial way, while the valley held them in its easy, sheltering fold. The sunset finished itself in a slow blaze of color that refused to hurry, and then the stars came out, reckless and bright in the way of open country where nothing competes with them. And Marcella Hadley, who had been Marcella Prescott, who had once walked into a saloon alone looking for the truth, stood under those stars with her husband's arm around her, and felt the full, solid weight of a life that was good, and closed, and hers.